Joining us on Times Now today is somebody in a rather unique situation, Rudy Rockman. He's a reservist in the paratrooper unit of the Israeli Defense Forces, currently at the front line ever since the October 7 attack on Israel by the Hamas. People are very confused about whether this attack was really about anti-Semitism or ultimately a territorial dispute, a land dispute of people who have been dispossessed, whose territory has been taken away, and who have been oppressed for decades. What do you say to that argument that religion and anti-Semitism is being brought into an argument which is essentially about people fighting for land?
That's a great question. I would say, first and foremost, this is not a war between Israelis and Palestinians or between Jews and Muslims. This is a war between Hamas and the citizens of Israel. Hamas targets civilians. It does not target the government. It does not target the soldiers. It targets civilians in order for civilians to be killed. Now, in Hamas's original charter, it stated that their goal was to destroy all the Jews of the land and to wipe them from the river into the sea in order to then eventually wipe the rest of the Jews off of the map of the earth. So it definitely is an anti-Semitic war where they're trying to kill the Jews and remove our presence on this land. And they're using Palestinians and their struggles, which are legitimate, in order to push their agenda. And I think most media out there are talking about Palestinian casualties only when it comes to Israel. They don't talk about the thousands of Palestinians that died in the Syrian civil war. They don't talk about the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that are still to this day suffering in refugee camps in Lebanon and in Jordan. They don't talk about Palestinians that are suffering on the border of Gaza and Egypt or under the Palestinian Authority and Hamas that are on their 20th year of their 4-year term. There's no freedom of speech and they're completely oppressing their peoples. So for me, Palestinians are my cousins. They're my family. We are connected and we both belong to this land eternally. The problem is that there are outside forces, some medias and some corporate groups and interest groups that are using this opportunity to use Palestinian struggles when cherry-picked and only when it fits their agenda, of course taking all the context out of it of how we've gotten into this situation to begin with, and using that as political ammunition to attack Israel's right to exist, which is anti-Semitic. If someone was against India's right to exist because they didn't like Indians, that would be a form of being against Indians. If someone was against the civil rights or the rights for black people, that would be a form of being against black people. If someone is against the right for the Jewish people to self-determine on their ancestral homeland, that is a form of being against the Jewish people, aka anti-Semitism.
You know, it's funny you say that because the Hamas has been quoted earlier in 2021. They actually said that what is being done to the Palestinians is exactly what happened to George Floyd. So people from Black Lives Matter should actually empathize with what Palestinians are going through, because it's the same kind of majoritarianism that was crushing blacks is also crushing the Palestinians.
That's a great point, and you have to understand how historically anti-Semitism has functioned. Historically, anti-Semitism is finding the source of struggle or suffering of a community or society and pinning it on the Jews. For the Christian death of Jesus, they blame the death of Jesus on the Jews. In Germany, after World War I, economic blame it on the Jews leading to the Holocaust. In Spain, after King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were bankrupt due to their colonization, they blamed it on the Jews leading to the Inquisition. We saw that with the Black Plague, with COVID, with literally anything that happens wrong in this world. Somehow someone finds a reason and a way to pin it onto the Jewish people. And so today in intellectual and political spaces, whether in universities or in the media, different groups that have the interest of convincing societies that the source of the problem is Israel are going to different minority groups like Black student unions or Black Lives Matter, like Native American groups, like women rights groups, like LGBTQ plus rights groups, and convincing them that if they want to fight for a better world, which they should, they must stand against Israel. And we need to call it out, where it comes from and how it must be dealt with.
No, I was also reading about you that as a student, you chose to pursue your bachelor's degree at Columbia because it was listed as, quote unquote, one of the most anti-Semitic colleges in the world. It's interesting because even after the October 7 attack, it was exactly in these university campuses, Harvard, Columbia, where you saw protests for Palestine being carried out.
Most students that are supporting Palestinians generally want to support Palestinians. It's just that they've been convinced that the way to support Palestinians is by destroying Israel. And I would say to them that the reality is that there is no future where either Israelis or Palestinians disappear. So pushing any narrative that's anti either population is actually anti both populations. And so what we've been seeing for the past 25 years on college campuses is a manipulation of information both by student groups and professors and administration that convincing the next generation's future political and intellectual class, because that's what university students represent, that the source of all problems is the Jews. They go to all the different minority student unions. They go to the black students and say, oh, you suffer from police brutality? Well, we suffer from IDF brutality. And they'll go even further by saying, well, the IDF is what trains the New York State Police Department to kill black people, as if black racism started in 1948 and wasn't existent before. Such a ridiculous claim to make. They'll go to Native American students and say, you suffer from white colonialists who stole your land. Well, the Jews are the same thing, which we're not. We're the indigenous peoples from the land. You dig in the land of Israel, you find Jewish history. And so it's been an attempt, ideological war, to convince all these different minority groups on the intellectual and ideological level that the source of all problems is Israel. And after years of doing that, when you have a scrimmage between Hamas and Israelis, they'll clearly get to the conclusion that they need to stand against Israel. And that's why I chose to go to Colombia, because I saw it as it's our responsibility to stand up against it and to rise above it.
Because, Rudy, the letter that, for example, was written by 20 student groups at Colombia said the weight of responsibility for war and casualties undeniably lies with the Israeli extremist government and other Western governments. The one at Harvard said that the Hamas attack did not happen in a vacuum, and the Israeli government has forced Palestinians to live in an open-air prison for over 2 decades. Now, the argument given is, we want to stand with the persecuted people. We are standing for the rights of Palestinians to exist, to live in a violence-free atmosphere. Why are we being painted as anti-Semitic? All we are saying is, don't kill Palestinians.
I wouldn't say that anyone that says don't kill Palestinians is anti-Semitic. I also say don't kill Palestinians. I support Palestinians. I fight every day to bring Israelis and Palestinians together. So anyone saying that is not an anti-Semite. The person that's intentionally using select instances of Palestinian suffering only when it fits their agenda to push an agenda of attacking and destroying, delegitimizing and dehumanizing the right of Israel to exist for the Jewish people, that's anti-Semitism. And talk about why there's a conflict right now. Hamas started shooting rockets into Israel, killed almost 1,300, we're at the number today, and kidnapped 200 civilians. And now there's a response to that. Now, Israel is only attacking and targeting specific Hamas locations. Now, why does Hamas have their militant locations and their rocket shooting from civilian areas? Why does Hamas prevent civilians from leaving those areas in order for them not to be casualties of war? Because Hamas's goal is to increase the number of casualties both from Israel and the Palestinian side in order to gain sympathy from the world that is clearly obsessed with Jews. I mean, recently, a few days ago, we had the bombing of the hospital. And immediately the medias were jumping because they thought it was Israel that was responsible. Eventually, proof came out showing that it was the Islamic Jihad trying to shoot rockets onto Israel, and one of those rockets misfired and hit the hospital. And the moment that this news came out, all of a sudden, no more medias are talking about the death of Palestinians. So it's very clear that they only care about Palestinians dying when it has to do with Israel, and that they're manipulating this information. And this is what we need to call out. Us Israelis and Palestinians need to wake up that most of the world doesn't actually care about us. They love seeing us fight. They love seeing us kill each other. And until we wake up from that reality, we're going to give them what they want. And it's time to get what we want, which is justice in this land.
But tell me about
for all of us.
I'm again going to draw you back to your experience in university campuses, especially in America. Many would argue, don't students have the right to express opinion? That's what university is supposed to be, about, a melting pot of ideas, where you talk about a variety of things and eventually find your center, as it were. Now we have a situation where, hedge funds have withdrawn their donation to various universities. Students have lost job offers. Isn't that bullying just because they expressed an opinion about the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Well, the same way that there's freedom of speech, there's freedom of reaction to speech. If someone were to go today to an intellectual space like a university and spew racism and say that black people are not or shouldn't be equal to white people, or spread some sort of xenophobia against any minority, whether it's women, Native Americans, Hispanic, or whatever it is, that person might even get kicked off of school. Nobody would want to employ that person. So if someone is pushing anti-Semitic remarks and saying that Jews should be killed, or justifying the fact, or saying that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, then yeah, there's a freedom of reaction to that speech as well. They have a right to say it. No one's preventing them from saying it, but other people have a right to respond to it as they should.
Why do you think this impulse exists? Is this, well-meaning folks who are getting taken along with a certain kind of narrative, or is it malicious? What did you find in your own experiences of this narrative that exists across several universities?
I think that the narrative that usually exists is it's pushing both aspirations of the collectives as mutually exclusive. people try to convince the students that in order to be pro-Israel, you must be anti-Palestinian, and in order to be pro-Palestinian, you must be anti-Israel. And that's not the reality, because we both belong to this land, and there are ways for us to move forward. I think this really started with the British, and I'm sure as someone who's living in India, you can relate to how the British, when they colonized, they divide and conquer. They divide and conquer Pakistan and India, they divide and conquer the three ethnic groups in Nigeria, they divide and conquer within Afghanistan, and they did the same thing between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And because we failed to recognize that in 1948, we fought a war. And we fought a war again in 1967, and we fought a war again in 1973, and the consequences of the conflict today are really the residual effects of those wars and that manipulation. And now there are different Western groups that are profiting from our conflict and selling weapons to both sides. And I think it's time for the Israelis and Palestinians to wake up and to realize that this is the land that we are from, and this is the land that our descendants belong to. And there is no way to move forward without each other. And I think instead of speaking to the rest of the world about how the other side is bad, we need to talk to each other, to humanize one another, to understand the injustices, and to understand the aspirations in order to build a future based on that.
Finally, I want to ask you, Rudy Rockman, you said in the middle that, Palestinians are like my brothers, but here you are deployed, you're in the Israeli Defense Forces, in the paratrooper unit. How do you reconcile your statement with the possibility that perhaps you may have to open fire or be face-to-face with those same Palestinians, or maybe one of those Palestinians could be caught in your crossfire? How do you reconcile to the morality of war?
It's an absolutely impossible and horrendous situation to be in, because although I see Jews and Arabs in general as cousins, we are both the descendants of Ibrahim, and we have many culture that's similar and genetics and experiences that are similar. Palestinians are even closer. 30 to 60% of Palestinians are actually descendants of Jews that were converted to Christianity and Islam and Arabized over time. So we're even more connected with Palestinians. And if a Jew went around killing other people, I would stop that Jew from killing other people. If a Palestinian, like Hamas member, is going to go and try to kill Israelis, I'm going to have to stand up and defend their life. But when the smoke settles, I think it's time for Israelis and Palestinians on a cultural level, on a people level, to start realizing we don't want to, in another 3, 4, 5 years, go into another war. We want to change things. So in order to change things, you need to understand the why, not just the what. When you go to a doctor and you show that you have symptoms, you don't just deal with the symptoms, you deal with the source of the problem. The symptoms are people dying today. The source of the problem are different interest groups and politicians that are profiting from this conflict, like Hamas, like the Palestinian Authority, like different countries out there that are supplying weapons to both sides. That is the source of this conflict. And the source of the solution will be the humanization of both sides, being able to see a Palestinian or an Israeli as a fellow human being, as a family member, understanding what our aspirations are, which are different and are not mutually exclusive, and understanding what the injustices that we go through, which are different as well, and don't exclude achieving a reality where they both don't exist. And I would even say that Israel, although not responsible for the creation of this conflict, has the power to be able to change this conflict, whereas most Palestinians don't. Israel actually has that power. So I put a lot of emphasis on the importance of Israel realizing that with the ability comes a responsibility. And that's what we need to start doing in Israel. We need to give Palestinians a different reality. We need to give Palestinians justice and the ability to live on this land and respect it. And I think once we change that reality for Palestinians, the situation will be much different.
Well, right now it's in a state of war. We wonder if that reconciliation is going to be an outcome of what we see happening right now. For the time being, though, thanks very much, Rudy Rockman, for speaking to us. Stay safe.